During the course of our vacation, we had occasion to be gone from here during the course of two national holidays, one national holiday of the United States and the other national holiday of Canada, because while, of course, last weekend, the 4th of July, is the national holiday that we take note of here as our American Independence Day. Just a matter of 3 days earlier, on the 1st of July, is the day that is recognized in Canada as Canada Day, or Dominion Day, as it was traditionally called, traditionally termed, which is the celebration of the Confederation that produced the nation of Canada. And this year was the 125th anniversary of the Canadian Confederation. And Queen Elizabeth was in Ottawa, which is the capital of Canada. Queen Elizabeth was in Ottawa for the celebration of the 1st of July and was there in her capacity as Queen of Canada to lead in the celebrations that took place. And, of course, this was on, all the celebrations were on the television, on the news there, and we were watching all of the pomp and ceremony and all of the display there at the Capitol and the Queen's speech. And the thought, of course, impresses itself as you watch something like that. Of course, having driven up through the heartland of so much of this country, the significance of what was actually taking place. Why is it that a nation such as Canada would recognize as its head of state a monarch who resides thousands of miles away? Why, in the United States, our head of state is the President of the United States. In Canada, as well as in Australia, New Zealand, the head of state is the Queen, who resides in London, represented in those nations by a Governor General, serving as head of state, and a Prime Minister, who is the head of government. Why is it that a nation such as that, which is an independent nation, a fully independent member of the community of nations, would recognize as its head of state a monarch who lives thousands of miles away? Why is it that we find in the United States and in Canada the fairest portion of the world's bounty and land surface? We find that our two nations, together with Australia, have served collectively as the breadbasket of the world. The vast, overwhelming majority of the foodstuffs that are exported in the entire world come from the United States, from Canada, from Australia, primarily, particularly the grain. There are some interesting parallels that we're going to note, but as we see something like that, as we see nations that traditionally have enjoyed the choicest bounty of the whole world, and nations to which the rest of the world has looked for many, many things, is it purely accidental that we enjoy the things that we do? There is a statement that the Apostle Paul made in the book of Acts chapter 17. In Acts chapter 17, as the Apostle Paul was speaking to the Athenians who were gathered on Mars Hill, he said in verse 24, God that made the world and all things therein. So the God that is the Creator God, the God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that He is Lord of heaven and earth, dwells not in temples made with hands, neither is worshipped with men's hands as though He needed anything, seeing He gives to all life and breath and all things, and has made of one blood all nations of men, for to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation. Now here is a remarkable thing. We're told that the Creator God, the God who made the heavens and the earth, the God who shaped the universe, who shaped this earth and the continents and the oceans, who laid out the configuration of this globe, has made of one blood all nations of men. The word here for nations is the Greek word ethnos, which is the word that we derive our term ethnic from. He is made of one blood all ethnic groups, all ethnos. Every branch of the human family is just that, a branch of the human family. You know, a lot of people are interested in tracing their ancestry, and some gone back quite a number of generations, and it's interesting to study about your forebearers and from where they've come. But you know, some may be able to go back 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 generations. Very, very few can go back any further than that. Time's going to come in the millennium when undoubtedly we'll be able to track it back as far as we want. And you know, maybe God's going to do this for the purpose of impressing something upon us all, because you know, if you had a vast chart that showed the genealogy of every person, at the top of the chart would be the same 2 names, Adam and Eve. Every human being that draws breath on this earth, you could trace your ancestry back far enough, you would finally wind up with Adam and Eve. There's not a human being that draws breath that does not derive from Adam and Eve. That's why Adam named his wife Eve. He gave to her the name Eve, which is, we're told in the book of Genesis, because she was the mother of all living, of all life, or all human life. Eve comes from a Hebrew word that the root word of which is life. So all human life came from Mother Eve. And of course, from Adam. Takes 2. God is made of one blood, all nations of men. So God could have done it a variety of ways. You know, God didn't make of one blood all dogs or all cats necessarily. There's no indication that He only started out, with that. When you come on down to the ark, I realized that there was one pair of unclean animals that was taken on the ark, but there were 7 pairs of clean animals. So, God didn't start out with just 2 of every single thing when He made the earth. The population dropped considerably at the time of the flood, down to just those that survived. But the point being that there was no particular need that the animal world have this sense of connection. But God made of one blood all nations, all branches of humanity. So God intended from the very beginning that the human race would be a family, that it would derive from one set of parents. Now God also intended from the beginning that family would have several distinct branches. We're going to note that in a few moments. He is made of one blood of nations, one blood, all nations of men, for to dwell on the face of the earth. He's determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation. So here, from verse 26, we understand that God plays a part in history. He has determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation. Why is it that certain nations are located in certain places? Why is it that different nations have had their period of world power and world dominance? If you look at ancient history, the first nation in ancient history, going back even before the flood and in the aftermath of the flood, the center of power was centered in Egypt. That was the first nation to achieve great power and great dominance, and occupied a very prominent position on the world scene for several thousand years. The next nation that other nations achieved power at other times, we find the Assyrians and we find the Babylonians. And as we come on down into the realm where God began specifically to work with an overview of history that we saw when we went through the book of Daniel, that stepped on the scene about 600 years before the time of Christ with the Babylonian Empire, and we saw the progression from the Babylonian Empire to the Empire of the Medes and the Persians, down to the Alexander the Great's Greek Empire that spread the Greek culture and language, and then all of that swallowed up by the Roman Empire, which has continued in various stages of revival and decline to dominate Western Europe in one form or fashion on down through the centuries, with periods when it was in abeyance and periods when it was in dominance. And we find that from the book of Daniel as well as from the book of Revelation that there is to be a final 10-nation union that will be revived, that will have worldwide domination. We find different nations located in different places. We're told here that God determined the times before appointed. The reason that certain nations rose to the fore at particular points in history, the reason that events converged in certain ways, was because God has a great master plan. God has a great master plan that He is working out, that ultimately will culminate with the establishment of the kingdom of God, the return of Jesus Christ to this earth, and the kingdom of God's establishment on this earth. All humanity ruled for 1,000 years as the nations are brought under the government of God. And at the end of that period, when all the dead, small and great, will stand before God, will have that opportunity for salvation, and the whole human race, ultimately, will have its opportunity to actually enter into, to be born into the very family of God. To enter God's very family. And of course, those who reject that opportunity and who do not avail themselves of the calling that God has given them will be destroyed, burned up in the lake of fire at the culmination of that. But God has a great time plan. God is working out a plan and a purpose. He has determined the times before appointed and the bounds of habitation. Empires have spread to a certain point, and there they have stopped. And they have not been able to go beyond. God established the bounds of habitation. Jesus Christ told His disciples when they asked Him if He was going to at that time restore the kingdom to Israel, speaking in Acts chapter 1, we've gone through the account at various times, He told them in Acts 1:7, "It's not for you to know the times or the seasons which the Father has put in His own power." You see, God has reserved certain things to Himself. Nebuchadnezzar had to learn, and his lesson is very vividly recorded in Scripture, that the Most High rules in the affairs of men. The Most High rules in the kingdoms of men and gives them to whomsoever He will. Sometimes even the basest of men. Nebuchadnezzar had to learn that there is a God in heaven who is supreme and who certainly can and does determine these matters. Moses writes of it in the book of Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, Deuteronomy 32 and verse 7, as Moses is speaking of God, in verse 3 he said, I will publish the name of the Eternal. Ascribe you greatness unto our God. He is the rock. His work is perfect. All His ways are judgment, of God of truth. Without iniquity, just and right is He. Coming on down in verse 7, he said, remember the days of old. Think about, reflect on history, on the events that have gone before. Remember the days of old. Consider the years of many generations. Think about the past. You know, those people who were our forebearers and the forebearers of all those of us who draw breath on the planet today were human beings and had human nature just like us. They went through certain lessons, and to the extent that we understand what they went through, to the extent that we understand the lessons that were learned and written in human experience of the past and the way that God has worked in the lives of those who have gone before, we can understand and appreciate more fully what's going on today. We can derive lessons that are of great benefit to understanding the world around us. So he says, remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations, ask your father and he will show you, your elders and they will tell you, when the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, when He separated the sons of Adam, He set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. For the Lord's portion is His people, Jacob is the lot of His inheritance. He found him in a desert land and in the waste, howling wilderness. He led him about and instructed him. He kept him as the apple of His eye. As an eagle stirs up her nest, flutters over her young, spreads abroad her wings, takes them, bears them on her wings, so the Lord alone did lead him, and there was no strange God with him. He made him to ride on the high places of the earth, that he might eat the increase of the field, and He made him to suck honey out of the rock, and oil out of the flinty rock. Butter of cattle and milk of sheep, fat of lambs and rams of the breed of Bashan, and goats with the fat of kidneys of wheat. You did drink the pure blood of the grape. So he talks about the dairy products, the great dairy industry. He talks about the cattle and the sheep. He talks about the wheat. He talks about the vineyards. And then he says, but Jeshurun, which is a poetic name referring to Israel, waxed fat and kicked. You're waxen fat, you're grown thick, you're covered with fatness. Then he forsook God which made him, and lightly esteemed the rock of his salvation. They provoked him to jealousy with strange gods. With abominations provoked they him to anger. They sacrificed to demons, not to God, to gods whom they knew not, to new gods that came newly up, whom your fathers feared not. Of the rock that begat you, you are unmindful, and have forgotten God that formed you. So, God goes on and talks about certain of these things, and we find here a reflection on the fact that God is the Creator. And God, again, makes reference, as we saw in verse 8, to the fact of a time when He divided to the nations their inheritance. Now, Acts tells us that He set the bounds of their habitation. He divided to the nations their inheritance. He separated the sons of Adam. So God made of one blood all nations that on the face of the earth do dwell, in that all humanity traces back to Adam, and He separated the sons of Adam. So we understand from verse 8 that the various branches of the human family, the various ethnic groups, particularly the basic racial stocks, derive not from some accident of nature. You know, scientists try to speculate on where did the different races, how did they originate, and they come up, and they're really never been able to explain that. How did they originate? Well, it goes back. It's very clear. They God separated the sons of Adam. They sprang directly from the children of Adam. You know, that must have been a remarkable thing. If you have children, one of the things that it's always interesting as your children grow is, which part of the family did they take after? It was sort of interesting. We were looking at some old family pictures up at when we were at my wife's family, looking some old pictures. And it was interesting as the grandchildren, most of them are getting on up older, and several are. My son and one other of his first cousins have already graduated from high school, and another two more are going to be graduating next year. And so they're all getting up to where for the next several years we're going to have one of my wife's nieces or nephews is going to be graduating every year for a while. It's interesting as we looked at different ones to note, they remind you, and you see certain family characteristics that remind you of this grandparent or that great-grandparent. When Adam and Eve had children, there were no parent. Adam and Eve didn't have any parents for them to take after. Didn't have any grandparents for them to take after. Didn't have any ancestry. What they had was what God had built into their bodies. The genetic blueprint that was there, every ovum that Eve possessed was created in her body at the time of her creation. That, of course, would have had to have been the case, because when a little girl baby is born in submicroscopic size, every ovum is already present and in existence, and doesn't later on as she matures and her body matures and those little cells grow, but they're already present. They're not manufactured in her body. They're present at the time of birth. So when Eve was created, those little cells that contained the genetic blueprint for her children, at least the portion of heredity that she would transmit, those were already present in her body. God had clearly built in genetic blueprints to produce all the different branches of the human family. Must have been remarkable. After Adam and Eve had a few children, we don't know how many they had, but we're told that they had sons and daughters. Josephus indicates that they had the Jewish historian indicates that they had quite a number of children. Look and see how long they lived, and you can imagine, they could have had quite a number. After a few had been born, it must have been really interesting, as they sat around and they waited the whole 9 months and they wondered what this one is going to, what's this one going to be? Because they didn't know. Because their children reflected all of the different branches of humanity that all of the different racial and ethnic stock derived from their children. God He divided to the nations their inheritance. He separated the sons of Adam. So the different branches of humanity had their beginning with the children of Adam. The children of Adam and Eve. And God separated those children out, and He divided to the nations their inheritance. So it's not an accident that certain ethnic groups dwell in certain areas. It's not accidental. It's not just happenstance of history. That was God's determination. And we're told in the latter part of verse 8, a very remarkable thing. He set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. Now, there weren't any children of Israel when Adam was created. But God had in mind from the beginning what He was going to do at the end. You read in the book of Revelation of the city that has 12 gates, the New Jerusalem, and we're told that the 12 gates are named after the 12 tribes of Israel. Each gate has a name. God had the blueprint for the New Jerusalem before He ever created Adam and Eve. God didn't sit down one day all impressed that this guy had 12 sons and decided he ought to build a city and name the gates after him. That's not how that came about. Jacob had 12 sons because that was the plan and the purpose of God. that there was to be a nation that was to derive a nation of Israel. God had prophesied that from the beginning. And God established certain boundaries. And we're told here that He chose Jacob, or chose Israel, as to be His people nationally, and that God made a selection. We're going to read a little more about that. God led them. He made them to ride on the high places of the earth, to eat the increase of the fields, the bounty and the abundance, to suck honey out of the rock, oil out of the flinty rock. A remarkable matter that a statement that would not have been understood. You know, this would have been read as simply a poetic statement up until the last 100 years. And people began to realize the value of the oil that comes out of flinty rock. You know, what kind of oil comes out of flinty rock? Well, the whole, this area of the country, we're the great deal of wealth has come out of the rocks, come out of the flinty rocks. This is a statement that for centuries people would read over, and it was just a poetic statement. It didn't really mean anything. That's the way God wrote the Bible. People can read over it, and at a certain point in time, certain statements become very meaningful. We read over it and we realize it's talking about the petroleum industry. It's talking about the mineral resources. God has blessed us with agriculture and with minerals and with all of these things. And yet, as He goes through, what He shows is that His people, whom He has blessed so abundantly and kept as the apple of His eye, what have they done? They've forsaken the God that's made them. They've lightly esteemed the rock of salvation. They've provoked Him to jealousy. They've gone after all sorts of strange religions and strange gods. They've forgotten the God that formed them. And God goes on here in the rest of Deuteronomy 32 to talk about a time when there is going to be national punishment. But we see that the existence of different branches of humanity was intended by God from the creation. God designed it in and determined and separated out the various branches of humanity, beginning with the family of Adam. He established the bounds of habitation, and He had in mind when He did so the existence of a nation that was not even in existence for the first 2.5 millennia of human history. The nation of Israel, over 2,500 years had passed, or about 2,500 years had passed before the nation of Israel ever even came into existence. But God had it in mind from the very beginning that He was going to work with a branch of humanity and use them as the starting point of dealing with all nations, because it was not God's point and plan to deal with simply one nation of humanity and no others. But anything you do, I don't care what project you undertake, you have to start somewhere. Working with humanity from a spiritual standpoint, God has started with us as a first fruits. The church, which is spiritual Israel, is a first fruits to God, spiritually. Well, that presupposes that if you have a first fruit, you're going to have more fruit that is coming later. So God is not in the process of stopping His plan of salvation with us. He has started with us. Now, why did God choose you and choose me? Why didn't He choose your neighbor or your relative or your cousin or somebody in some other location or some other city or some other nation? Is it unfair because God chose you and didn't choose your relative or your friend or your neighbor? No. Shall the thing that's made say to the potter, "Why have you made me thus?" Does the creation say to the Creator, "Well, you shouldn't have done it this way"? The sovereignty of God presupposes that God has God is the one who established the creation, and God established a plan and a way in which He chooses to work with His creation. And the fact that God has chosen to call certain ones at certain times is the prerogative of God and the sovereignty of God. That God is over all and He chooses. He chooses where He starts in terms of working with humanity from a spiritual standpoint. And He also chose where He started in terms of working with humanity from a physical standpoint. In the book of Genesis chapter 12, we read in Genesis 12:1 that the Eternal said unto Abram, "Get you out of your country and from your kindred and from your father's house unto a land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation. And I will bless you and will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless you and curse him that curses you, and in you shall all the families of the earth be blessed." Now, one of the things that clearly is shown here in Genesis 12:1 is God took the initiative. You don't see that Abram went to God and said, "God, where do you want me to go?" What you find is that God went to Abraham and said, "Abraham, I want you to leave. I want you to leave this place because I have a plan for you and for your descendants." God took the initiative. God took the initiative, and that's important to understand. God has a great plan that He is working out, and God takes the initiative in the accomplishment and the achievement of that plan. And God said to Abraham, "I want you to leave this area where you are. I want you to go somewhere else because I have a plan in mind for you and your descendants. I'm going to make of you a great nation. And I'm going to bless you. I'll make your name great. And you are going to be a blessing. And I'm going to bless him that blesses you and curse him that curses you." We're told that Abram departed. He got up and left. He did what God said, which immediately marked him out as a remarkable man, because most people have not responded to God in quite that way. God chose Abraham. Later on, He refers to Abraham as Abraham, his friend. We find that Abraham departed. He was 75 years old when he left Haran, which was where they were at the time. We find in verse 6 that he passed through the land unto the place of Shechem to the plain of Moab, and the Canaanite was then in the land. So the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "Unto your seed will I give this land," and there builded he an altar unto the Lord who appeared unto him. And he removed from thence unto a mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west and Hai on the east. And he built an altar unto the Eternal, and he called upon the name of the Eternal. So God said, "Get out of your land, go to a place that I will show you." He went to a place that was inhabited by a totally different group of people, a different branch of humanity. And God said, "This is where this is the place, I'm giving it to you." Now, Abraham must have wondered, if you or I had been there, what would you have wondered? Great, looks like a nice place. Now, I know it's mine and you know it's mine. You've told me and I believe you. No problem. But what I'm wondering is who's going to break the news to them? Abraham didn't want to be the one to show up and serve an eviction notice on some of these people. They may not have taken very kindly to that. Now, it was not God's purpose. God didn't tell him right at this point that, Abraham, I'm actually not going to give it to you personally. I'm going to give it to your descendants, and you won't inherit it until after you've died, been in the grave for thousands of years, and been resurrected. God didn't tell him that at that point in his life. That was not necessary for him to know. Humanly, we always want to know when. God generally chooses not to tell us when, because that's where faith comes in. God tells us, we believe it, we trust it, we live our lives based on what we cannot see. What we cannot touch and taste and feel and measure and discern with the five physical senses. We live our lives based on what cannot be discerned by the five physical senses. We live our lives based on faith. And it is God's purpose that we do. Because the just shall live by faith. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. Abraham became the father of the faithful because he lived his life based on faith. God made a promise, Abraham believed it, and he lived his life. We find later on that Abraham lived to be 175. So for 100 years, Abraham lived in a land where he was a stranger. And the only part of it that he owned was a burial plot that he bought when his wife died. And that was the only part that Abraham ever had. And he had to buy and pay for that. But you see, God had a plan. And He told him He was going to make of him a great nation. Well, we go on through the story and we read of Abraham and the things that would occur. Later on, God told Abraham, did a rare thing. He told Abraham something about the timing of his plan. We find in Genesis 15:13. He said to Abraham, "Know of a surety that your seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years." So, for the next 400 years, from the time of Abraham's death until the Israelites divided and apportioned the promised land, 400 years elapsed from the death of Abraham until his seed finally received an inheritance. They were strangers. They lived in places that weren't theirs. They were afflicted and mistreated by different ones. And God says, "The nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward they will come out with great substance. But you will go to your fathers in peace, and you'll be buried in a good old age, and in the fourth generation they will come here again. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full." So God said, it's not time to dispossess these people. I know the direction they're headed, and I'm going to execute judgment against them, but I'm not going to do so right now. But I know where things are headed, and the time will come when I will step in. Down in Genesis chapter 17 and verse 1, we find that Abraham was 99. He was 99 years old. And the Eternal appeared to Abraham, and He said, "I am the Almighty God. Walk before me and be you perfect." Or be upright. Be sincere. Be wholehearted. "And I will make my covenant between me and you and will multiply you exceedingly." And Abraham fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, "As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be a father of many nations." Now, earlier, God had just told him, "I'm going to make of you a great nation." Now He says, "You're going to be the father of many nations. Neither shall your name be any more called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham," which means a father of many nations. "For a father of many nations have I made you. And I will make you exceeding fruitful, and I'll make nations of you, and kings shall come out of you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you, and your seed after you, and their generation, for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto you and to your seed after you. And I will give unto you and to your seed after you the land whereon you're a stranger, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God." So God made a covenant with Abraham. God said of Abraham in Genesis 18:19, or Genesis 18, let's pick it up in verse 17. The Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham that which I do? Seeing that Abraham shall become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him." All the nations of the earth. So Abraham's descendants were to be a blessing in the midst of the earth. They were to be a blessing. And they have been. I'm going to mention a few ways of that because it is important that we understand that God has fulfilled that, and the descendants of Abraham have been a blessing to the world in many, many ways. Abraham should become a great and mighty nation, and all nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they will keep the way of the Lord to do justice, judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he's spoken. So God said, I know that Abraham will properly transmit values to his children and grandchildren, here in the case of Isaac, in the case of Jacob, that would enable God to bring about what he had promised. Now, we find later in Genesis 21 the birth of Isaac. Chapter 22, we have the testing of Abraham by God in his willingness to sacrifice Isaac, the supreme test to which God placed Abraham. And Abraham was told following this test in Genesis 22, verse 15, the angel of the Lord called to Abraham out of heaven the second time, and he said, By myself have I sworn, says the Eternal, because you've done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son, that in blessing I will bless you, and in multiplying I will multiply your seed as the stars of the heaven and as the sand which is on the seashore, and your seed shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in your seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So here, God made an unconditional covenant, a covenant that was conditioned upon the obedience of Abraham. And he said, I'm going to multiply your seed. Your seed will possess the gate of his enemies. You know, the gates are what control entrance and exit. That's the means by which entrance and exit is made. So here, Abraham's descendants would eventually come into a position where they controlled the means of access, the means of entrance and exit that had to be utilized by their enemies. And all nations would be blessed in his descendants because Abraham had obeyed the voice of God. Now, there are two aspects of this prophecy. One is a physical, national aspect, and the other is a spiritual aspect. The spiritual aspect had to do with the fact that the Messiah would be born of the family of Abraham. And through him, all nations would be able to be blessed, to have God's blessing. But just as there is a spiritual aspect, clearly there is also a physical aspect, because he speaks of seed plural. I will multiply. You know, seed can be a word. It is in the English and it also is in the Hebrew. It is a word that can mean either one or it can mean many. You can speak of seed and by seed you can mean one seed, or you can mean a lot of seed. So there is a dual aspect of this prophecy. Clearly, verse 17 refers to a multiplication of seed, a plurality, many descendants. Well, as we come on down, that we find in Genesis 24 that Abraham called his most trusted servant to send him back to the land of Ur of the Chaldees to find a wife for his son Isaac. Isaac was by this time 40 years of age, was unmarried. The family of Abraham was a distinct minority in the land of Canaan. And Abraham understood that it was appropriate that he find a wife for his son of the same basic stock from which he himself had sprung. And yet he knew that it was not good for his son to go back there. And if you want to know why, all you have to do is read a little further. When his grandson Jacob did go back there, he got entangled in a mess that took him decades to get out of. You see, there was a reason why God told Abraham, leave that family behind. Leave that bunch and get away from it. Because some of the things you read about some of the family Abraham left behind, you realize that they would serve as an entanglement and a snare that would interfere with his service to God, and he had to leave. So he had done so, and he understood that it was not a good idea for Isaac to get back there because of fear that Isaac would become entangled in things that he would never get out of. And yet he took his most trusted servant and he dispatched him. And Abraham obviously trusted the man a great deal because this servant loaded up camels with all sorts of wealth and things to testify to the prominence of Abraham and took it back. You know, what was to keep him from fleeing to Egypt or taking off somewhere else? Abraham trusted this man and was a man for whom he had great regard. His most trusted servant who went back to the land of Ur of the Chaldees, and the story goes on, and of course Rebekah was the wife that God had chosen for Isaac. So he understood that and went back and brought Rebekah, and she was willing to come. She was given a choice in the matter, Genesis 25:57. She elected to go and came, and Isaac took her as his wife and grew to love her, as we're told in verse 67. Now, Genesis 25, we find that Rebekah conceived and bore twins. These twins were Jacob and Esau. And two distinct peoples came forth. And we find that there was a remarkable thing here, that Esau was actually, there were twins, but Esau was the one who was born first. And the prophecy had been made prior to the birth of the twins that the elder would serve the younger. Now, normally, the elder would be the one to receive the birthright. But the blessings would be transmitted in that way. But here a prophecy was made. Again, the election, the sovereignty of God, God determined that while these children were yet in their mother's womb. And that they would come forth. And we find that when they were born, Jacob came out with his hand on Esau's heel. And that was sort of the way that Jacob lived his life, as we find later on. Jacob was a remarkable man in a lot of ways. He was a person that had some very difficult lessons to learn before God could work with him and could accomplish through him what he chose to do. Jacob was happy. Jacob was a conniver. He was an individual who found it very difficult to wait on God. He was not a patient person. He was a man who was sort of a wheeler-dealer. He was a businessman. He was an individual who was always looking for the angle and how to do certain things. And one day Esau had been out hunting for several days, had evidently not killed anything. He came in, he was hungry, and we find that Jacob was cooking up some sort of stew, and Esau was tired and hungry and just felt faint. And Jacob said, "If you want some stew," he said, I'll give it to you, but you have to agree to sell me your birthright. I'll trade you some of my stew here for your birthright. Well, this shows how lightly Esau esteemed the birthright. Later on, he wished he'd had it back, but he quickly agreed. He said, that's not going to do me any good if I starve to death. Here, give me some soup. So Jacob was the sort of guy that you would not want to do business with. He would be always looking for the sharp angle. It's no amazing thing that his descendants bought Manhattan from the Indians for the equivalent of about $24. Jacob was a real shrewd businessman. He was always out to cut a deal. And so Esau sold his birthright to Jacob. And we're told in verse 34 that Esau despised his birthright. He treated it cheaply, casually, no big deal. Well, as we come on down through the story, a little while later in chapter 27, we find that Isaac was old. He had lost his sight. Perhaps what we would say would diagnose as cataracts that he had in his advanced old age. We're told that his eyes were dim so that he could not see. That is a very apt description of what we know as cataracts. But anyway, whether it was that or something else, he had gotten to the point that he could not see. He could not see to distinguish even his children. So the time was that Jacob had the birthright, or had connived Esau out of the birthright, and he wanted the blessing from his father to go with it. And so, with his mother's urging, you see, the story was Isaac and Rebekah had known the prophecy, but somehow Isaac had a special closeness with Esau, and he kept putting off the transmission of the birthright and the blessing to Jacob, even though he knew that God had elected to do it that way from before the birth of the boys. Isaac had a special affinity for his son Esau, and he perhaps kept hoping that God would somehow change his mind, or that it could be done a little differently, and so he had hesitated doing that. Now, Rebekah, on the other hand, Jacob was somewhat of a mama's boy, and he was especially close to her. And she wanted to ensure that Jacob got this blessing. And they got tired of waiting. And so they cooked up a plan that Isaac had asked Esau to go out and hunt some venison and come and fix him a good savory stew. Now, a real sauce piquant to go with that venison. So you see, that goes back a long ways in the family too. He liked good spicy cooking. And Rebekah said, I'll tell you what, I'm going to kill a goat kid, and I can make that sauce up, and by the time I get through spicing it up, he won't be able to tell the goat from the venison. He'll never know the difference. By the time I put all this stuff in it and get the sauce done just right, and you take it in and you give it to him, and he'll think you're Esau, and he will give you the blessing. Well, that, of course, is what happened. We're told in verse 35, he came with subtlety and took away the blessing. And boy, was Esau mad. Oh, he was furious. Well, he had a grudge against Jacob. And we're told on down a little further in chapter 27 that Rebekah, at this point, Jacob was not married. Esau had taken wives from the inhabitants of the land. And Rebekah said to Isaac in Genesis 27:46, I'm weary of my life because of the daughters of Heth. It just makes me sick to death of what Esau has done. And if Jacob takes a wife of the daughters of Heth, such as these which are in the daughters of the land, what good shall my life do to me? So Isaac called Jacob and blessed him and charged him and said, You shall not take a wife of the daughters of Canaan. Arise, go to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take you a wife from thence of the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. And the Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and multiply you, that you may be a multitude of people, and give you the blessing of Abraham. Give the blessing of Abraham to you and to your seed after you, that you may inherit the land where you're a stranger, which God gave to Abraham. So Isaac understood, and after this event and this trickery, Isaac realized and had known for many years that it was God's purpose for Jacob to have the birthright. And the blessing. But he kept putting it off and putting it off. And Jacob took it into his own hands because things weren't moving on his time schedule. And so he decided that he would speed the process up. And Isaac understood after that and realized that he probably should have done this a whole lot earlier. And so he went ahead and confirmed this blessing in chapter 28 and told him, go back and acquire a wife that comes from our people. Now, he had failed to really grasp the seriousness of sending his son back rather than having done as his father had done and sent a servant. Because what we find, of course, as you go through the next several chapters, is when Jacob met up with old Uncle Laban, he met up with a businessman's businessman. You talk about cutting a sharp deal. It doesn't say if Laban ran a used camel lot or not, but he's not the kind of guy you'd have wanted to buy a used camel from, I'll tell you that. He was always finagling. Jacob at one point made mention that Laban had changed his wages 10 different times. You know, they'd make a deal, and every time Jacob would start getting ahead, Laban had cut another deal. He would somehow, there'd be a little fine print in the contract, and Laban had changed it again. Laban was bound and determined that he was going to come out on top. He had the 2 daughters, and Jacob wanted one, and he agreed to work 7 years, and Laban passed the other one off on him, and then got him to work 7 more years. He got rid of both daughters, and he got 14 years worth of free labor out of a man that was an excellent overseer and manager. And so, Laban was a sharp character, but, God allows things. And God allowed Jacob to fall into the hands of an unscrupulous, conniving businessman, his uncle. See, it ran in the family. Probably one of the reasons God wanted Abraham to get out of there. Ran in the family. And Jacob had to learn a lesson. Sometimes you have to be on the receiving end of what you've dished out to come to the point of seeing what it's really like and coming to the point of real repentance. Because when you come on down to Genesis chapter 28, you realize Jacob, this is when Jacob is on his way to back to Padan Aram. We find that he dreamed a dream. He stopped and he spent the night. He put a stone there for a pillow and lay down in the place, and he dreamed. And in his dream he saw a ladder from heaven to earth, and he saw angels coming and going. And the Eternal stood above it in this dream and said, this is verse 13 of Genesis 28, I am the Lord God of Abraham your father and the God of Isaac. The land whereon you lie, to you will I give it into your seed, and your seed shall be as the dust of the earth. And you shall spread abroad to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south. And in you and in your seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. All the families. We're told here that Jacob, verse 18, rose up early the next morning, took a stone, the one that he had for his pillow, and he set it up and made a pillar out of it, anointed it with oil, and called it Bethel. And he vowed a vow. Verse 20, and said, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way where I go, and will give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, so that I'll come again to my father's house in peace, then shall the Lord be my God, and this stone shall be a pillar, shall be God's house, and I'll give you a tenth. He said, God, if you'll watch over me and take care of me, here Jacob's going to cut a deal with God now. He says, I tell you what, I got a deal for you. If you'll take care of me and bless me and bring me back home safely, then you'll be my God. Boy, I'm really going to get serious. I'm going to start really serving you. I'm going to start tithing, as he mentions in verse 22. I'm going to really serve you faithfully if you take care of me and bring me back. So, he didn't say, I'll start right now. He said, I'll start when I get back. I got some things to tend to. I'll check back in with you later, God. And if you take care of me and bring me back safely, well, boy, when I'll really start being good. Well, you don't cut deals with God. And over the course of the next few decades, Jacob had occasion to realize that. As he began to realize he didn't want to wait until he got back to find God. He wanted to find God in a big hurry because he got involved in something that he could not extricate himself from. And if it hadn't been for God's mercy and God's intervention, he never would have gotten loose from Laban. So there's a lesson to learn. Jacob was brought to repentance, and God changed his name from Jacob to Israel. Israel means a prince with God, a prevailer with God. Because he did have that characteristic of tenacity, which he was demonstrated as we come on through the story. The name Jacob, which meant supplanter, was no longer the name by which he was called. His name was changed to Israel. But notice as we've noticed, the birthright blessing has been expanded. God told Abraham, I'm going to make of you a great nation. Then he said, I'm going to make of you a great multitude of nations. Here, and I'm going to give you the land where you are. Here, Jacob was told, I'm going to give you the blessings that I promised to Abraham, and your seed is going to multiply and it's going to spread abroad. So you're not just going to be here in this land, in the Middle East. You're going to spread abroad to the north, to the west, to the east, to the south. You're going to spread abroad and come in contact with all of humanity. And in you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Remember what we read in Deuteronomy 32, that God divided to the nations their inheritance. He separated the sons of Adam. He set their number He set their bounds according to the number of the children of Israel. You see, it was God's purpose that the descendants of Jacob would spread abroad all over the earth, would be a great colonizing people. Well, as we come on down through the story, you remember the story of Jacob and his Leah and Rachel and the 12 sons that Jacob had. And as we come to the end of the life of Jacob, in Genesis 49, he called his children together. Now, in chapter 48, Joseph, who was the 11th of the 12 sons, Joseph was not the 11th, but he was one of the sons of. He was the first son of Rachel. Rachel had two sons, Joseph and Benjamin. The others were other children. Joseph, we're told here in Genesis 48, who of course had been in Egypt for many years, and his father Jacob, who had finally come down with the rest of the family into Egypt, was in a situation, the last period of his life, the last days of his life. He was already sick in bed. And Joseph, in Genesis 48:1, took his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and brought them in to Jacob. And Jacob said to Joseph, began to recount the blessings that God had given him, and asked Joseph to bring the two sons there. And Joseph brought them, and Jacob, was going to lay his hands on the two boys. Now, as he proposed to lay his hands on them, Joseph lined them up because he knew that his father couldn't see and wouldn't know one boy from the other. So he lined them up to where the older of the boys, Manasseh, would be in front of Jacob's right hand, and the younger, Ephraim, would be by his left hand. When Jacob got ready to lay hands on the boys and to pray for them, he crossed his hands. We're told that Joseph stopped him and said, "No, wait a minute, Dad, you're mixed up here. I had the boys lined up right, and you're putting your right hand on the younger and your left hand on the older." And Jacob says, "I know what I'm doing." This was under God's direct inspiration. And he said verse 19, he said, "I know what I'm doing. He, Manasseh, shall be a people, and he shall be great. He will be a great people, a great nation. But his younger brother, Ephraim, shall be greater than he, and his seed shall become a multitude of nations." And he blessed them that day. We're told in verse 16 that he said, "Let my name be named on them, and the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth." Let my name, the name Israel, be on them. So here Jacob then called his sons together and prophesied what would come upon them in the last days. Genesis 49:1. And he began to go through, and he started with Reuben, his firstborn, and he comes on down. And I don't have time to go into all of the details. We will come back perhaps into some of this. But we see here the blessings that God gave. And the birthright blessings transmitted through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, down through the sons. And specifically, the birthright was transmitted to Ephraim and Manasseh. That's made very plain. 1 Chronicles 5:2 says, Judah prevailed among his brethren, and of him came the chief ruler, but the birthright was Joseph's. 1 Chronicles 5:2. The birthright came to Joseph, but the scepter, the promise of the line of kings, came through Judah. And so, of course, we find coming down through Judah the royal line of King David. And that was established, that would reign. God said He would establish the throne of David forever. And of course, therein lies the story of why there is a queen that to this day sits on the throne of David, and the stone on which she sat to be coronated in 1953, the coronation, that stone is the very stone that is identified as Jacob's pillar stone. The stones on which the kings of England have been crowned since the time of King Edward I. Prior to that, for several hundred years, the kings of Scotland had been crowned in Scone on that stone from the time of Kenneth MacAlpin back in the 9th century. Prior to that, the stone had been in Tara in Ireland, and the high kings of Ireland had been coronated on that stone, going back to the time of the 5th century BC, when it had been transported from the Middle East by Jacob, or by Jeremiah and his servant Barak, along with along with the king's daughter, King Zedekiah's daughter, known in Irish history as Tea Tefi, who married the son of the High King of Ireland. And from that time thence, that stone was the stone on which the kings of Ireland were coronated, until it was transported from Tara in Ireland to Scone in Scotland, and then from Scone in Scotland down to London, England. And of course, as you go back through the book of Chronicles, you find that the kings of Israel, the kings of David's line, had been coronated on that stone. That is an aside and gets into a different matter. But when we read in Leviticus chapter 26, we find the story of what God said would happen, the blessings that He promised, and then the curses that He said would come if and when the nation disobeyed. And He said that if they didn't learn from that, in Leviticus 26:18, He said He would punish them 7 times for their sins. Now, as we went into in the book of Daniel, we calculated out the 7 times from a prophetic standpoint, 2,520 years. If you look at the fall of Israel, the capture of the northern 10 tribes, the fall of Israel in Samaria in 721 BC, and you come down 2,520 years, it brings you to 1800. Did there emerge on the world scene a great nation and a great company of nations that began to emerge in the first decade of the 19th century? Well, there certainly did. The English-speaking world, the United States, the British Commonwealth nations, began their clear emergence on the world scene as the dominant power. As we see right on down the events that began to take place, that sort of interesting that the very flag of Great Britain was adopted in 1801, and the name of that flag is the Union Jack, which is just simply a slang term for the Union of Jacob. That's literally what it is a reference to, and it was a combination of the flags of England, Scotland, and Ireland. The United Kingdom was proclaimed in 1801, and the Union Jack flag was adopted. You find the events that occurred in the aftermath of that. 1803, the Louisiana Purchase, which effectively doubled the size of the United States and put us in possession of the great heartland of this country, the great agricultural heartland of this entire nation. We've been the granary of the world, the United States and Britain and Canada, Australia, the granary of the world, just as the whole world looked to Joseph anciently for grain, so has the modern world looked to the descendants of Joseph. Just as Joseph anciently fed the world, so hath his descendants. God has put us in possession of the choicest bounty of the earth. He has blessed us in many ways, and there certainly have been many blessings and things that the nation took part in. Interestingly enough, it was in 1807, just a few years after the beginning of the pouring out of the birthright blessings, that the British Parliament passed legislation to empower the British Navy to end the slave trade on the high seas. That was something that had existed from time immemorial. And as one modern historian wrote, that it was at that point in time that there emerged on the scene a world policeman, a role that was played by Britain throughout the 19th century as it began to impose certain standards and to take responsibility for seeing that certain things were done. And there are many, many stories that we could go into, amazing things that sort of interesting. Right around that same time, I think it was in 1804, that the British and Foreign Bible Society was founded, which had as its goal the translation of the Scriptures into every language and the providing of a copy of the Bible to every person. And that process of making the Word of God available to all humanity had its beginnings right at that time. There were some technological revolutions that took place in printing that made possible large-scale printing. Rotary printing was invented. Prior to that time, you had to print flat sheets, which effectively limited production of books to 2,000 or 3,000. Now, with rotary printing, the development of rotary printing, large-scale printing was possible, and the effective transmission of at least the Word of God, making that available. And yet, what we found and what God prophesied is our nations have been blessed. The British Empire came to be the greatest empire that had ever held sway on the earth. Over 25% of the world's land surface and the world's people lived under the Union Jack, under the British flag, scattered around this world as a great colonizing people. One of the prophecies made of Joseph, that he would be a fruitful bough planted by a well, spreading up and out and over in all directions. The United States spreading across the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific. God, who determined the bounds of their habitation, the times before appointed. It became God's time in history for these events, the birthright blessings, to be poured out. And they set the stage for the work of God's church. Because you see, the birthright blessings poured out and the prosperity that came about in the United States and British Commonwealth nations, the spread of English as a virtual universal language, set the stage for the end-time proclamation of the gospel. It meant that there were nations that had the wealth and the prosperity so extensively spread that even the poor and middle class of those nations were able to, that the tithes and offerings of that group of people was enough to do a work on a worldwide basis, because that's who God used. He didn't start out calling the great, the noble, the powerful. He didn't call the Rockefellers and the Mellons and the Morgans. He didn't call the wealthy and the elite, but He called average people and farmers and people who were not the most wealthy at all of society, and yet living in a land where even the poor lived on a level far, far exceeding the case of the poor in other lands. And so God had set the stage with the distribution of wealth for a work to be done. The spread of the English language meant that there was a means of communication as God's Word spread out from the nations of Ephraim and Manasseh. As Ephraim grew into a great company of nations, the British Empire, the British Commonwealth, that's why to this day there is a tie, there is a binding tie that ties peoples all over the world together looking to one throne. that throne that was prophesied of, that God established through David and was transmitted on down, the throne that Jesus Christ himself will take at his return. We find Manasseh a great nation. Just as Britain emerged on the scene first and was the dominant power in the world for the next 100 years, from the fall of Napoleon in 1815 until the fall of Napoleon in 1814 to the beginning of World War I in 1914, 100 years, was really the British century. The gates of their enemies, the crucial sea gates all over the world, the means by which world commerce and transportation had to move, were all in American or British hands, mostly British hands. The Panama Canal was in American hands. But the Suez Canal that connected up made possible rapid transportation from the Mediterranean down into the Indian Ocean, all around the world. We could go into those things. There's not time to do so. But what we find is very clearly the fulfillment of the promises that God has brought about. But he said in Deuteronomy 32 that while he had done this and God fulfilled his part, that the nation had grown indifferent. And he prophesied ahead of time that they would cease to appreciate what God had done and to really value and appreciate that God was the author and the source, and would turn after other gods and would pursue other things. That sin of ingratitude. We have come through a period time where we celebrated a national holiday, and we should certainly reflect on the fact that what we have because God has given it to us. Oh, I grant you, there have been many times when some of our forebearers have shown a lot more in common with carnal Jacob than they did with converted Israel, in the sense that they maybe acquired some of the birthright blessings the same way Jacob set out to acquire them from Esau. But the fact that they ran true to type didn't negate the promise and the effectiveness of what God had in mind. And there are many, many aspects that we could go into that there's simply not time to do. Perhaps we will at a later time to show the historical fulfillment of these things. But it is important that we understand it, because as a nation, we don't understand these things. And yet, the very identity of our people and what's going to happen to us hinges, an understanding of that hinges on the understanding of our identity in Bible prophecy. And we certainly, of all people, should be most grateful that God allows us to live in the land where He has poured out the choicest bounty and the choicest blessings. That's a benefit and a blessing from God. We should be thankful to God, realizing God is the source of these things. The nation has not been thankful, and the nation will receive ultimately God's chastisement. We should not be accounted among those who are ungrateful and unappreciative and who don't give the credit and the glory to God, and realize that because of the obedience of Abraham, the obedience of one man, that God made a promise that He's fulfilling right on down to this day. We should be very grateful to God, very thankful and very appreciative, and understand these things and understand what it portends in the future for all of us and for our nation.